When you hear the name Leonardo da Vinci, you probably picture one thing: the Mona Lisa, behind glass, surrounded by tourists with their phones up. Art history has turned Leonardo into the ultimate painter. But if you could ask him what he did for a living, artist might not even make his top 3 answers. When he wrote a long job application letter to Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, Leonardo listed 10 things he could do. He described how he could design bridges, dig canals, build fortifications, invent weapons, plan public works. Only at the very end did he add, almost offhand, that he could also paint. To Leonardo, painting was not separate from science and engineering. It was one of the ways he tested ideas about light, anatomy, motion, and geometry. The same mind that gave us the Mona Lisa also dissected human bodies, designed flying machines, studied how water flows, analyzed fossils in mountain rocks, and explained why the dark side of the moon glows faintly. In this video, we're going to meet that Leonardo, not just the genius with a paintbrush, but the scientist and engineer whose work was quietly centuries ahead of its time, then mislabeled by history as just art. Leonardo was born in 1452 in a small hamlet near the town of Vinci in Tuscany. His father was a well-respected notary, his mother a peasant girl. Because he was born out of wedlock, Leonardo never got the full classical education that legitimate sons received. No Latin grammar, no Greek philosophy, no university lectures. Instead, his classroom was the world around him. He watched water running through ditches, clouds forming over the hills, birds gliding in the air. Later he would write that experience is the true teacher, and that theories must be tested against what the senses reveal. His talent for drawing showed early. His father took some of his sketches to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's leading artists and craftsmen. Verrocchio's workshop was like a Renaissance startup lab. They painted altarpieces, cast bronze statues, built theatrical sets, designed costumes, and worked on architectural projects. Leonardo learned how to grind pigments, mix varnishes, cast metal, carve wood, and design mechanisms for moving scenery. There's a famous story that when Leonardo painted an angel in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, it was so lifelike that Verrocchio supposedly swore never to paint again. Whether or not that's literally true, it captures something real. Leonardo wasn't just trying to copy what things looked like, he was trying to understand how they were built. That urge to understand took Leonardo somewhere most artists never went, into the dissecting room. In the late 1400s, medical knowledge was still largely based on old texts rather than direct observation. There were no anatomical atlases you could trust. If you wanted to know what was inside a human body, you had one option: open one. With permission from hospitals and medical schools, Leonardo watched dissections and eventually performed his own. Over several decades, he studied around 30 human corpses of different ages and conditions. He worked mostly at night in cold rooms, methodically removing skin, muscle, and organs to reveal the structures beneath. The drawings that came out of this work are astonishing. He depicted skeletons from multiple angles, showed how muscles layer over each other, traced nerves and tendons, and dissected the eye, the spine, even the brain. He sketched a fetus in the uterus with remarkable accuracy and sensitivity. Next to these images, he covered the page with dense, mirror-written notes, right to left, legible only in a mirror. As a left-hander, it kept him from smearing ink, but it also meant his notebooks were hard to read for others. Today, anatomists still admire the precision of his work. Many of his drawings are accurate enough to be used in modern medical teaching. Leonardo wasn't just drawing bodies to paint them better, he was dissecting them to explain how they functioned, the way a scientist takes apart a machine. That scientific anatomy flowed straight into his art. Look at the Mona Lisa. That strange, elusive smile is not just a lucky accident. Leonardo had spent years studying the muscles of the face, how tiny fibers at the corners of the mouth pull upward, how the cheeks round, how the eyelids narrow when someone smiles for real. He knew exactly which shapes to suggest and which to blur to make the smile feel alive and constantly changing as you look. He did similar homework on light. He studied how brightness falls off with distance, how colors fade in a haze, how shadows soften at their edges. From that came his famous technique sfumato, literally smoky. Instead of sharp outlines, he layered many thin glazes of paint to create very soft transitions. Skin, air, and fabric seemed to dissolve into one another, just as they do in real vision. In The Last Supper, you see his scientific mind in the composition. It looks like a religious drama, and it is, but underneath is a strict mathematical structure. All the lines of perspective in the room converge on a single point at Christ's head. Architecture, table, and windows all act like arrows guiding your eye. Leonardo also treated painting like chemistry. As artists moved from egg tempera to oil, he experimented with recipes, gently heating pigments in linseed oil, adding a bit of beeswax to keep colors from darkening. He was constantly testing materials, adjusting methods, and keeping notes, an experimental lab wrapped in a painting studio. While the world now celebrates his canvases, many of Leonardo's employers were more interested in something else: his machines. In Milan, he was hired largely as a military engineer. His notebooks from that time are full of plans for fortifications, bridges, and weapons. Armored vehicles shaped like turtles, giant crossbows the size of small buildings, multi-barreled cannons designed for rapid fire. Some were probably more for display than practical battle use, but they show how he thought in terms of forces, gears, and motion. Beyond war, he drew designs for cranes, pumps, mills, and stage machinery. One particularly modern-looking sketch shows a self-propelled cart powered by coiled springs with a steering mechanism at the front. It's essentially a programmable, gear-driven robot centuries before such things existed. Then there was flight. Leonardo became obsessed with birds. He watched how they angled their wings, how they used air currents to rise and circle, how feathers flexed and overlapped. He filled pages with wing diagrams and notes on air resistance. From those observations came gliders, flapping wing machines, and his most famous design, the aerial screw. It looks like a giant spinning screw made of reed and linen. 4 men would push the bars at the base, rotating the screw and, in theory, lifting it into the air. With the materials and understanding available at the time, it would never have flown. But conceptually, Leonardo was exploring the idea of a rotating helical surface generating lift, the same principle that would eventually make helicopters possible. He also imagined a parachute, a linen canopy shaped like a pyramid, large enough to slow a person's fall from any height. In 2000, a modern skydiver built one from Leonardo's design and successfully jumped with it, proving that 500-year-old sketch was more than just fantasy. One of Leonardo's greatest lifelong obsessions was water. He called it the vehicle of nature and treated it like a living thing. He sketched waterfalls, eddies, floods, and breaking waves with the same care he once reserved for muscles and bones. He watched how currents met and twisted, how stones changed a river's course, how foam traced invisible spirals in moving streams. A large part of a famous notebook now called the Codex Leicester is devoted to these studies. On its pages, you see cross-sections of rivers, experiments with dams and channels, and diagrams of swirling vortices. Leonardo wondered how sediments settle, why water carves certain shapes into rock, and how you could harness or redirect flows for human use. He turned that knowledge into practical engineering. In northern Italy, he designed canal systems not just to move boats, but to irrigate fields and drain marshes. To handle changes in water level, he improved the lock gate. Instead of simple flat gates, he proposed two gates that met at an angle pointing upstream. The water pressure would push them closed more tightly, an elegant self-sealing system. Variations of that miter lock are still used in canals around the world today. Watching water interact with rock led him into early geology too. He noticed seashells embedded high in mountain stone and argued that those rocks must have once been under the sea. He studied layers of sediment and concluded that slow, constant processes, deposition, erosion, shape the Earth over long spans of time. In a culture that believed in a young, fixed world, Leonardo quietly began to see a dynamic, ancient planet governed by physical laws. From rivers and rocks, Leonardo's eye moved to things that grow, plants and people. His botanical drawings are some of the most delicate images he ever produced. Using red chalk or pen and ink, he traced every vein in a leaf, every twist in a stem, every fold in a petal. They're beautiful, but they're also investigations. He noticed that leaves often spiral around stems in regular patterns, each positioned to avoid casting too much shade on the one below. He observed how branches divide so that the combined thickness of the offspring branches roughly equals the thickness of the parent branch. Centuries later, botanists would give names and formulas to what he'd already sketched by observation. He also obsessed over proportions in the human body. The most famous example is the Vitruvian Man, a nude figure with arms and legs outstretched, fitting perfectly into both a circle and a square. The drawing is based on notes from the Roman architect Vitruvius, but Leonardo checked and refined those ideas by measuring actual people. He annotated how many heads total an average man is, how the span of the arms compares to height, where the navel sits in relation to the whole body. It's a perfect example of his approach. Start with an old idea, test it against reality, adjust the model. Whether he was tracing veins in a leaf or limbs in a human figure, Leonardo was always reaching for the same thing: rules hidden beneath appearances, patterns that repeat from one scale to another. Among all his anatomical studies, the heart captured Leonardo's imagination more than any other organ. He called it a wonderful instrument and examined it with the same curiosity he brought to machines. He dissected animal and human hearts, slicing them open and drawing them in cross-section. He traced the four chambers, mapped the valves, and sketched the major vessels leading in and out. At a time when many physicians still clung to the idea that the heart was mainly a source of innate heat, Leonardo insisted it was a muscular pump. He drew how the valves opened and closed with each beat to keep blood moving forward, and he experimented with models to see how fluids swirled as they passed through. Around 1506, he observed the peaceful death of a man said to be about 100 years old. Intrigued, Leonardo dissected the body to find out what had caused such a quiet ending. In the man's heart, he found narrowed, hardened coronary arteries. He concluded that the blockages in these vessels had been the cause of death. That is essentially an early description of coronary artery disease, written almost 150 years before physicians officially recognized it. Leonardo came very close to a modern understanding of circulation. He didn't fully break away from old theories that blood was constantly created and consumed, but his drawings and notes show blood moving in a continuous loop driven by the heart's mechanical action. Again, science was happening, just never published. Leonardo's curiosity didn't stop at the body or the ground beneath his feet. He looked up, too. One subtle mystery in the night sky caught his attention. When the moon is a thin crescent, the dark part isn't completely black. It glows faintly. Today, we call that Earthshine, the dark side of the moon lit dimly by sunlight reflected from the Earth. Leonardo reasoned that if the Earth is a sphere lit by the sun, then it must reflect light just like the moon does. Some of that reflected light would strike the moon's night side and bounce back to our eyes, creating the faint glow we see between the points of the crescent. In sketches and notes, he drew rays of light leaving the sun, hitting the Earth, then bouncing to the moon and from there to an observer. It was a simple but profound idea. Earth was not a fixed center, but another body in space, obeying the same rules as the moon and planets. Most people of his day had no sense of the Earth as a shining globe among many. Cosmology was still dominated by old models that put us at the unmoving center. Leonardo's explanation of Earthshine quietly undermined that picture. It placed Earth inside a physical system, not above it. Even when staging a court spectacle late in life, actors dressed as planets circling a mock sun and moon, he was playing with ideas he had reasoned through as a scientist: motion, light, and perspective scaled up into theater. When Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519 at the Château du Clos-Lucé in France, he left behind only a few dozen paintings that we can confidently attribute to him. Many were unfinished. For someone called one of the greatest artists of all time, the number is surprisingly small. What he did leave was a mountain of paper, thousands of sketches, diagrams, and pages of notes, anatomy from head to toe, designs for machines, canals, and fortresses, studies of plants, water, rocks, and clouds, thoughts on optics, astronomy, and geometry, all scattered across notebooks, most written in mirror script, none edited into the polished books he frequently said he would write. Those notebooks weren't published, they weren't widely read. After his death, they were broken up, sold, lost, and rediscovered. By the time scholars really began to study them, medicine, physics, and engineering had moved on, often rediscovering the same principles independently. History, meanwhile, found an easier story to tell. Leonardo the artist, Leonardo the painter of the Mona Lisa, Leonardo the creator of the Last Supper. But open his notebooks and a different figure emerges, a man who refused to accept authority without evidence, who trusted experiments over tradition, who shifted seamlessly from biology to hydraulics to astronomy, who used drawing as a tool to think with, not just to decorate. He dissected bodies like a surgeon would, tested fluids like a physicist, designed structures like an engineer, and calculated proportions like a mathematician. Painting to him was just one more science, a way to study light, matter, and perception. So yes, Leonardo da Vinci was an artist, but he was also something that didn't have a name in his time, a scientist in the full modern sense. History filed him under art because those works hung on walls. His science stayed locked in notebooks. Today, we can finally read both and see him for what he truly was, a mind that tried to understand everything.